Stop saving for us, Mom. We don't want your help. Sarah's words hit me like ice water. I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed against my ear, watching the steam rise from my untouched oatmeal. The spoon felt heavy in my arthritic fingers, and I set it down with a soft clink against the ceramic bowl. 43 years of motherhood, and this is what it came to. My daughter's voice, sharp and dismissive, cutting through the morning quiet like a blade through silk. We're adults now. We can handle our own finances. The irony would have been laughable if it wasn't so cruel. I could hear Michael in the background, my son-in-law, probably nodding his approval from their granite kitchen countertop. The one I'd helped them finance when they bought the house 3 years ago. The same Michael who'd called me at 11:30 at night 3 months ago, voice thick with desperation and what I now realized was probably wine, begging for help with their struggling restaurant. Mom, are you listening? I was listening, all right. Listening to the sound of 30 years of sacrifice being dismissed with the casual cruelty that only family can manage. The same man who'd sat at this very kitchen table, head in his hands, while Sarah painted pictures of their dream crumbling without the loan I'd promised them. The bistro downtown with the exposed brick walls and the vintage chandelier Sarah had fallen in love with. The place where she'd finally use her culinary degree. Where Michael would manage the books with his MBA. $300,000. That's what they'd asked for. Nearly everything I had left after Harold died, sweetheart. The money from his life insurance. The policy he'd insisted on even when we could barely afford the premiums. The small inheritance from my mother, who'd lived through the Depression and saved every penny she could. The savings account Harold and I had fed nickels and dimes into for 35 years, watching it grow like the oak tree in our backyard. I'd said yes without hesitation, because that's what mothers do. We give until there's nothing left to give. That's what I'd learned from my own mother, who worked 2 jobs to keep us fed after my father left. That's what I'd practiced for 4 decades, putting Harold's needs first, then the children's, then whatever was left over for myself. But now they didn't want it. I see, I managed, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. Too calm, too measured. I walked to the window above the sink, looking out at the garden Harold and I had planted together 20 years ago. The roses were blooming late this year, deep red against the white picket fence he'd painted every spring until arthritis made holding a brush too painful. And this decision? When did you both come to this? Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Sarah's tone had that practiced patience I recognized from her teenage years, the voice she used when she thought I was being particularly slow. We've been talking to a financial advisor, and he says what, Sarah? The sharpness in my own voice surprised me. I gripped the edge of the sink, feeling the cool porcelain under my palms. That your 72-year-old mother shouldn't be trusted with her own money? A pause. Too long. In that silence, I heard everything she wasn't saying. I heard whispered conversations between her and Michael, discussions about my age, my competence, my fitness to make. I heard the words they thought but wouldn't say: burden, senile, confused. It's not about trust. It's about independence. Dependence. The word sat bitter on my tongue. This from the girl who'd called me crying 6 months ago because she couldn't make rent on the apartment they'd insisted on in the expensive part of town. The same daughter who'd borrowed my car for just a weekend and kept it for 3 weeks while hers was being repossessed, leaving me stranded, without transportation to my doctor's appointments. I remembered that conversation clearly. Sarah standing in my living room, tears streaming down her face, mascara making dark tracks on her cheeks. We just need a little help getting back on our feet, Mom. Just until the restaurant starts turning a profit. I'd held her then, my grown daughter, and felt her body shake with sobs against my shoulder. I'd smoothed her hair the same way I had when she was 5 and had fallen off her bicycle. I'd whispered the same words. It's okay, sweetheart. Mama's here. Mama will fix it. And I'd meant it. I'd already started the process of liquidating my retirement funds, talking to Margaret at the bank about business loan procedures, researching the best ways to transfer large sums without triggering too many taxes or penalties. I'd spent sleepless nights calculating and recalculating, making sure I could give them what they needed while still having enough left over for my own expenses, my medications, the small emergencies that come with age. You know what, sweetheart? I walked to my desk in the living room, the cordless phone tucked between my shoulder and ear. My fingers found the business card I'd kept right there, next to the framed photo of Sarah's wedding day. In the picture, she was radiant in her grandmother's altered dress, Harold walking her down the aisle with tears in his eyes. Michael looked young and earnest in his rented tuxedo, promising to love and cherish my daughter forever. You're absolutely right. I am? You're adults. You should handle your own finances. I was already dialing the bank's number on my landline with my free hand, muscle memory guiding my fingers across the familiar numbers. So I'm calling off the loan. Mom, wait. No. You've made yourself very clear. You don't want my help. The bank's automated system picked up on the second ring, that cheerful recorded voice asking me to press 1 for checking, 2 for savings. I pressed 0, then 0 again, navigating to a human being. I'm sure your financial advisor has much better solutions than a confused old woman like me. That's not what I said, isn't it? I found myself walking to the front window, looking out at the street where Harold and I had walked hand in hand every evening for 30 years. Mrs. Henderson was watering her flowers across the street, the same routine she'd followed for as long as I could remember. Life going on, steady and predictable, while my world shifted beneath my feet. Sarah, I spent last night awake, figuring out how to liquidate my retirement funds without too many penalties. I was going to surprise you both with the full amount today. The silence stretched longer this time. I could hear Michael's voice in the background, urgent now, but I couldn't make out the words, probably realizing they'd overplayed their hand, that independence was a luxury they couldn't afford. Mrs. Patterson? A woman's voice came, through the landline. Margaret from the business accounts department. I'd spoken with her twice this week about the loan arrangements, going over paperwork, discussing interest rates, timing for the transfer. Yes, Margaret, I need to cancel the business loan we discussed, all of it. Mom, please. Sarah's voice cracked, and for a moment she sounded like the little girl who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. The full $300,000 commitment. I continued to wait. Margaret, my voice steady as stone. Effective immediately, but Mrs. Patterson, we have the papers ready for signing this afternoon. Your daughter and son-in-law have already been in to complete their portion of the application. We were just waiting for your final signature. So they'd already been to the bank, already started the process, assuming I'd go along with whatever they decided, probably discussing the terms with the loan officer, making plans for the money, my money, without bothering to include me in the conversation. I understand. Cancel it all. I watched a cardinal land on Harold's bird feeder, the same bright red male that had been visiting our yard for 3 years now. Harold had named him Chester, insisting it was the same bird, even though I'd pointed out that cardinals don't live that long. But Harold liked continuity, tradition, the comfort of familiar things. Unlike his wife, apparently, who couldn't tell when she was being managed and manipulated by her own child. Mom! Sarah's voice was rising now, panic creeping in like water through a cracked foundation. You don't understand. We still need the money. We just wanted to handle it differently, maybe through a different bank, with better terms. Oh, I understand perfectly. Chester flew away, a flash of red against the morning sky, and I felt something inside me take flight with him. You wanted the money without the burden of owing it to your mother. You wanted my help without having to be grateful for it. That's not... Margaret, are you still there? Yes, ma'am. I'll need you to come in and sign some paperwork, but the hold on funds can be released immediately. Thank you. I hung up the landline and brought the cordless phone back to my ear. Sarah was crying now, soft hiccuping sobs that once would have broken my heart, would have sent me scrambling to fix whatever was wrong, to make her world right again. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Clarity, like stepping out of a house filled with smoke and taking that first deep breath of clean air. "Here's what's going to happen," I said quietly, settling into Harold's old recliner. The leather was worn soft from 40 years of his evening news routine, shaped to his body in a way that had always made me smile. "You're going to figure out your restaurant situation without your confused old mother. You're going to be the independent adults you claim you want to be." "Mom, we made a mistake." "Yes, you did." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of something lifting from my chest, something I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was there. But you know what? So did I. "What do you mean?" The words came out before I could stop them, honest and sharp and necessary. "I've been helping you fail for too long, sweetheart. Maybe it's time you learned what success actually costs." The call ended with Sarah still talking, words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush to take back. What couldn't be taken back? I set the phone on the side table and sat in the quiet of my little house, listening to the grandfather clock tick on the mantel. The one Harold's father had left us, the one that had marked time through every joy and sorrow of our marriage. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The doorbell rang 20 minutes later. I almost didn't answer the door. After 43 years of motherhood, I'd learned to recognize the sound of trouble arriving. Uninvited. But the ringing was polite, measured. 3 short bursts, followed by respectful silence. Not the frantic hammering of someone in crisis, not the impatient lean-on-the-button approach of solicitors. Through the frosted glass of the front door, I could make out the silhouette of a woman in a dark suit, tall, professional-looking, carrying what appeared to be a briefcase. My first thought was that the bank had sent someone, that Margaret had dispatched a representative to handle the loan cancellation in person. I opened the door to find a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a charcoal business suit that looked expensive, the kind of clothing that whispered competence rather than shouting it. "Mrs. Eleanor Patterson?" "Yes." I kept one hand on the doorframe, ready to close it if this turned out to be some sort of sales pitch disguised as official business. "My name is Catherine Reeves. I'm an attorney with Hartwell, Morrison & Associates." She reached into her briefcase and produced a business card, holding it out with both hands like a peace offering. "I represent the estate of Robert Chen. I believe you knew him as Bobby." The name hit me like a physical blow. Bobby Chen. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 25 years, though I'd thought about him often enough. Bobby, who'd worked alongside Harold at the telecommunications company for 30 years. Bobby, who'd been Harold's best friend and fishing partner until that terrible falling out in 1999. Bobby, who'd died of a heart attack 3 months ago, according to the brief obituary I'd found in the newspaper. Yes, I knew Bobby. My voice sounded strange, hollow. "But I don't understand why—" "May I come in, Mrs. Patterson? I have some information that I think you'll find quite significant." I hesitated. 30 years ago, Harold would have been here to handle this, to ask the right questions, and make the appropriate decisions. But Harold had been gone for 2 years now, and I'd learned to navigate these waters alone. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. "Of course." I stepped back, gesturing her into the living room. "Can I offer you some coffee? Tea? Coffee would be wonderful, thank you." I busied myself in the kitchen, grateful for the familiar routine. My hands shook slightly as I measured coffee grounds, and I found myself listening to Catherine Reeves moving around my living room, the soft sound of her heels on the hardwood, the whisper of fabric as she settled into a chair. When I returned with 2 mugs, she was sitting in the chair across from Harold's recliner, her briefcase open on the coffee table between us. Several manila folders were arranged in neat stacks, along with what appeared to be legal documents. "Mrs. Patterson," she began, accepting the coffee with a grateful nod, "I need to ask you something that might seem unusual. Did your husband ever mention anything about a business partnership with Robert Chen? Something beyond their employment at the telecommunications company?" I frowned, settling into Harold's chair. The leather was still warm from where I'd been sitting earlier, still held the impression of my body. "A business partnership? No, I don't think so. Harold never mentioned anything like that. Catherine nodded as if she'd expected this answer. Mr. Chen indicated in his will that this might be the case. He left detailed instructions that if anything happened to him, I was to contact you personally and share certain information. She reached for one of the folders, extracting a letter written in Bobby's familiar handwriting. Even from across the coffee table, I could see my name written across the top in his careful script. Before I give you this letter, I need to provide some context. Catherine's voice was gentle but professional, the tone of someone accustomed to delivering surprising news. In 1985, Mr. Chen and your husband jointly purchased a small piece of commercial property downtown. The initial investment was relatively modest, $8,000 each, but the property has appreciated significantly over the years. My coffee cup rattled against the saucer as I set it down. That's impossible. Harold would have told me about something like that. I thought you might say that. Catherine reached for another folder, pulling out what appeared to be a deed. According to Mr. Chen's records, your husband was very concerned about protecting this investment from potential creditors or family financial pressures. Apparently, he'd seen too many of his co-workers lose their savings to children's financial emergencies or medical bills. The words hit closer to home than I cared to admit. How many times over the years had we dipped into our savings for Sarah's crises? The time she'd totaled her car and needed money for a replacement. The year Michael lost his job and they couldn't make their mortgage payments. The endless stream of emergencies that somehow always required our immediate financial intervention. The property was purchased under a business entity, Catherine continued, with very specific instructions that neither spouse was to be informed unless both partners agreed or in the event of one partner's death. I stared at the deed, trying to process what she was telling me. My Harold, who discussed every major purchase with me, who asked my opinion on everything from new kitchen appliances to vacation destinations, had kept a secret investment for nearly 40 years. The falling out between your husband and Mr. Chen, Catherine said softly. It wasn't about money or business, was it? I shook my head, remembering that terrible time. Harold never told me exactly what happened. They'd been so close, and then suddenly Bobby wasn't welcome in our house anymore. Harold would get this look on his face whenever Bobby's name came up. Not angry. Exactly, but hurt. Deeply hurt. According to Mr. Chen's letter, the disagreement was about whether to tell you about the property. Your husband wanted to inform you after your daughter's first financial crisis in the late 1990s. Mr. Chen was adamant that they stick to their original agreement. I closed my eyes, seeing that period of our marriage with new clarity. Harold had been distant for months after the falling out with Bobby, distracted and troubled in a way I couldn't understand. I'd assumed it was just the natural cooling of an old friendship, the kind of thing that happens sometimes as people age and grow apart. They never spoke again? Not directly, no. But Mr. Chen never stopped caring about your husband or about you. Catherine lifted the letter from Bobby's handwriting. He left very specific instructions about what should happen to his half of the property when he died. My throat felt dry. What kind of instructions? He left his share to you, Mrs. Patterson. Complete ownership of his half of the property, with a right of first refusal on your husband's half if you ever choose to sell. The room seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the arms of Harold's chair, feeling the familiar texture of the worn leather under my palms. I don't understand. Why would he do that? Catherine leaned forward, her expression kind but serious. The property is currently leased to a small tech company. The monthly rental income is substantial, approximately $12,000 per month, split between the two partners. Your husband's half has been automatically deposited into a separate account for the past 2 years since his death. $12,000 per month. I thought about the careful budgeting I'd been doing since Harold died, the way I'd been stretching his Social Security and pension payments to cover my living expenses, the sleepless nights I'd spent calculating whether I could afford to help Sarah and Michael without leaving myself destitute. Mrs. Patterson, are you all right? I realized I was crying, not the desperate, broken sobs I'd shed when Harold died, but quiet tears of something I couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe, or anger at Harold for keeping such a massive secret, or gratitude toward Bobby, who'd somehow found a way to take care of me Even after 40 years of silence, there's more, Catherine said gently. The property is in a prime location, and there have been several offers to purchase over the years. Mr. Chen refused them all, but he wanted you to know that the current market value is estimated at approximately $2.8 million. The number hung in the air like something foreign, incomprehensible. $2.8 million. Half of which had been mine all along, generated by an investment my husband had made before Sarah was even born. He loved you both very much, Catherine said, holding out Bobby's letter. He asked me to give you this and to tell you that he never stopped regretting the way things ended between him and Harold. I took the letter with trembling hands, feeling the weight of years of silence and misunderstanding. Bobby's handwriting was shakier than I remembered, touched by age and illness, but still unmistakably his. As I unfolded the paper, my phone rang from the kitchen. The caller ID, visible from where I sat, showed Sarah's number. I let it ring. Dear Eleanor. Bobby's handwriting swam before my eyes as I tried to focus on the words. The phone had stopped, ringing, but I could hear it starting up again from the kitchen. Sarah, probably, calling back with increasing desperation. Let her wait. For once in my life, let someone else do the waiting. If you're reading this, then Harold is gone, and I'm gone too, and Catherine has done what I asked her to do. I hope you can forgive an old man for keeping secrets. But I promised your husband I would honor his wishes even when I thought he was making a mistake. I set the letter down, my hands trembling. Catherine sat quietly across from me, sipping her coffee with the patience of someone accustomed to giving people time to absorb life-changing news. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, marking time that suddenly felt different, weighted with possibility instead of just passing. Harold wanted to protect you from our children's financial emergencies. You remember how it was with our generation? We watched our parents lose everything in the Depression, saw good people destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. Harold was terrified that Sarah's problems would eventually consume everything you both had worked for. A bitter laugh escaped my throat. Harold's fears had been justified, hadn't they? How many thousands of dollars had we given Sarah over the years? How many times had I dipped into our savings account, our retirement funds, our emergency reserves to solve her latest crisis? And now, this morning, she'd called to dismiss my help as unwanted interference. I picked up the letter again, forcing myself to focus on Bobby's careful script. The property on Maple Street. Do you remember it? The old Henderson building where Harold and I used to eat lunch when we were working downtown? We bought it in 1985 when old Mrs. Henderson died and her children wanted to sell quickly. Harold saw the potential immediately. That corner is going to be valuable someday, he said. He was right, as usual. I did remember the building. A narrow, 3-story brick structure, wedged between what had been a hardware store and a used bookshop. Harold and Bobby had eaten lunch there almost every day for years, sitting at the small counter while Mrs. Henderson served them coffee and sandwiches. I'd always assumed they just liked the food. We agreed from the beginning that our wives shouldn't know. Not because we didn't trust you, but because we'd both seen too many good investments destroyed by family needs. Harold especially was worried about Sarah. Even then, when she was still a teenager, he could see the patterns forming. The way she expected problems to be solved by other people. The way she never quite learned to manage money. The phone started ringing again. This time it was a different tone. The landline, not my cell phone. Sarah had probably tried my cell and gotten frustrated when I didn't answer. Now she was working her way through every number she had for me. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, Catherine following with quiet interest. The caller ID showed Sarah's number, just as I'd expected. I reached for the phone, then stopped. Mrs. Patterson? Catherine's voice was gentle. Is everything all right? I looked at her, this stranger who'd just told me I was worth nearly $3 million, and felt something shift inside my chest. My daughter is calling. She and her husband need money for their restaurant. This morning they told me they didn't want my help anymore. They wanted to be independent. Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly. And now? Now they've probably realized they still need the money. I watched the phone ring once more, then fall silent. They just don't want to owe it to their confused old mother. I returned to the living room and sat down, picking up Bobby's letter again. Catherine settled back into her chair, her coffee growing cold on the table between us. When Harold wanted to tell you about the property after Sarah's divorce, I convinced him to wait. I thought we were protecting your... I was wrong. Harold carried that secret like a stone in his chest for the rest of his life. He loved you so much, Eleanor. Everything he did was to protect you and provide for you, even keeping secrets from you. Sarah's divorce. I remembered that time clearly. The lawyers, the custody battles, the endless financial needs. Sarah had moved back home for 6 months, bringing her drama and her tears, and her expectation that we would fix everything. Harold had been, during that period, distracted in a way I hadn't understood. Now I knew why. He'd been fighting with his best friend about whether to tell me we had resources that could solve Sarah's problems without destroying our own financial security. The property generates substantial income now. Tech companies have transformed that part of downtown, and the rent reflects the change. You don't need to worry about money anymore, Eleanor. You don't need to choose between your own security and your daughter's emergencies. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of decades of financial anxiety lifting from my shoulders. How many nights had I lain awake after Harold died, calculating and recalculating my budget? How many times had I chosen the generic medication over the name brand, the store brand groceries over the ones I preferred, just to make the numbers work? And all this time, money had been flowing into an account I didn't know existed. The cell phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A text message this time. Then another, then a third. Catherine glanced toward the kitchen. Would you like me to step outside while you handle your family situation? No. The word came out more firmly than I'd intended. They can wait. I thought about Sarah's voice this morning, that careful patience she used when she thought I was being slow or difficult. The way she'd dismissed my offer to help as if it were an embarrassment rather than a sacrifice. Catherine, can I ask you something? Of course. This money, the rental income that's been accumulating since Harold died, is it legally mine? Absolutely. Harold's will left everything to you, including assets you weren't aware of. Mr. Chen's bequest gives you full ownership of his half as well. You're the sole owner of a very valuable property. The phone rang again. This time I got up and answered it. Mom! Sarah's voice was breathless with relief. Thank God. I've been trying to reach you for an hour. I've been busy. Look, about this morning. We need to talk. Michael and I have been discussing things, and we realize we may have been unclear about our needs. Unclear. That was one way to put it. Really. I kept my voice neutral, watching Catherine pretend not to listen. The thing is, Mom, we do still need the loan. We just want to handle it more professionally. Maybe with some formal documentation, interest payments, that sort of thing. So it's more like a real business transaction. I see. I could almost hear the desperation under Sarah's careful words. And what changed your mind about wanting to be independent? A pause. We talked to our financial advisor again. He explained that family loans can actually be structured in ways that benefit everyone. Tax advantages, that sort of thing. How convenient. I walked to the window, looking out at the garden Harold and I had tended together for 30 years. And what did this advisor say about the timing? Well, that's the thing. We need to move on this pretty quickly. The sellers are getting impatient, and if we don't secure financing by next Friday, we'll lose the property. Next Friday. 6 days from now. Just enough time to create a sense of urgency, to make me feel like I had to decide immediately, or risk devastating my daughter's dreams. Sarah, let me ask you something. When you went to the bank this week to fill out the loan application, what exactly did you tell them about our family's financial situation? Longer this time. What do you mean? Did you discuss my income, my assets, my ability to guarantee such a large loan? Mom, where is this coming from? We just filled out the standard paperwork. Because Margaret at the bank mentioned that you and Michael had already completed your portion of the application. That suggests you provided information about the collateral for the loan. Silence. Sarah? We may have mentioned the house, your house, as Potential security for the loan. The words hit me like cold water. The home Harold and I had bought as newlyweds, where we'd raised our children, where I'd nursed him through his final illness. They'd offered it as collateral without asking me. I looked at Catherine, who was watching me with sharp interest. And what happens if the restaurant fails and you can't repay the loan? It won't fail, Mom. We have a solid business plan. But what happens if it does? Mom, please, you're overthinking this. We just need you to come to the bank tomorrow and sign the papers. Everything is already arranged. Everything arranged. By everyone except me. I'll call you back, I said quietly. Mom, wait. I hung up the phone and turned to Catherine. If I wanted to make some changes to how I handle my finances, what would you recommend? Catherine smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, I saw something sharp and calculating in her expression. I think that depends on what kind of changes you have in mind. I thought about Harold, keeping secrets to protect me. About Bobby, leaving me a fortune to ensure I'd never be vulnerable again. About Sarah, assuming my house was hers to risk. The kind that would surprise people, I said. Catherine Reeves, I discovered, was not just an attorney. She was a strategist. The first thing we need to do, she said, settling back into her chair with the confidence of someone accustomed to rebuilding lives, is get you to the property. You need to see what you own before you make any decisions about how to use it. I found myself nodding, though part of me wondered what Harold would think about his widow plotting financial maneuvers with a lawyer he'd never met. But Harold wasn't here to ask, and I was tired of making decisions based on what dead men might have wanted. Can we go today? Absolutely. Catherine glanced at her watch. It's only 10:30. We could drive downtown, I could show you the building, introduce you to the tenant. Then, if you're interested, I'd like you to meet with my partner, James Morrison. He specializes in estate planning and asset protection. Asset protection. The phrase felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd never learned. For 43 years, my assets had consisted of Harold's paycheck, our modest savings account, and whatever was left over after we'd solved everyone else's financial emergencies. Now, apparently, I needed protection for assets I'd never known existed. What exactly? Would this Morrison person help me protect my assets from? Catherine's smile was sharp as a blade. Family members who might feel entitled to make financial decisions on your behalf. Adult children who assume their parents' resources are available for their use. People who might question your mental competency when you start asserting control over your own money. The words hit home with uncomfortable precision. I thought about Sarah's careful tone this morning, the way she'd spoken to me like I was a confused child who needed guidance, the way she and Michael had filled out loan paperwork using my house as collateral without bothering to ask. More often than you'd think, especially when substantial amounts of money are involved. Catherine closed her briefcase with a decisive snap. Adult children get very protective of their inheritance when they discover their parents have means they didn't know about. I thought about that for a moment, imagining Sarah's reaction when she learned about the property. Would she be happy for me? Grateful that I wouldn't have to struggle financially? Or would she immediately start calculating how this new information affected her own future? I was afraid I already knew the answer. Let's go see this building, I said. The drive downtown took 20 minutes, through neighborhoods that had changed dramatically since Harold and I had stopped, making regular trips into the city. Coffee shops and yoga studios had replaced the old hardware stores and five and dimes. Young people in expensive athletic wear walked dogs that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Catherine pulled her silver BMW into a parking space on Maple Street, and I found myself looking up at a building I'd passed 1,000 times without really seeing. 3 stories of red brick, with large windows that had been recently updated, and a small sign by the front door that read, TechFlow Solutions. The ground floor is retail space, Catherine explained as we got out of the car. Currently leased to a small software company. The second and third floors are office space, also leased to tech companies. The rental market for this type of space has exploded in the past 5 years. I stared up at the building, trying to reconcile this valuable piece of real estate with the modest lunch counter where Harold and Bobby had eaten sandwiches for 30 years. What happened to Mrs. Henderson's restaurant? The new tenants kept some of the original features. Would you like to see inside? We walked through the front door into a modern office space that bore no resemblance to the small restaurant I remembered. Exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and sleek furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine. A young man with carefully styled hair and an expensive shirt looked up from a standing desk near the window. "Ms. Reeves, good to see you again." He approached with the kind of confident smile that suggested he was accustomed to impressing visitors. "Is this the new owner you mentioned? David Chen, meet Eleanor Patterson." "Eleanor, David is the operations manager for TechFlow Solutions." David extended his hand with the firm grip of someone who'd learned early that handshakes mattered. "Mrs. Patterson, it's such a pleasure to meet you. We absolutely love this space. The location is perfect for our business, and the building has so much character. Thank you." I looked around the transformed space, trying to imagine Harold and Bobby sitting at Mrs. Henderson's counter. "How long have you been here?" 3 years now, and we're hoping to expand into the second floor when the current lease expires. We'd love to discuss a long-term arrangement, maybe even explore the possibility of purchasing the building eventually. Catherine and I exchanged glances. "That's interesting," I said carefully. "What kind of business are you in?" "We develop custom software solutions for small businesses, inventory management, customer relationship systems, that sort of thing. It's a growing market, especially with so many companies moving to digital platforms." David launched into an enthusiastic explanation of his company's services, and I found myself only half listening. Instead, I was watching Catherine, noting the way she observed everything with sharp attention. The expensive computer equipment visible through glass office doors, the casual mention of expansion plans, the confident assumption that the building might be available for purchase. "The rental income from this floor alone," Catherine murmured when David stepped away to take a phone call, "is $8,000 per month. $8,000. For space that had once generated maybe $300 a month selling coffee and sandwiches to telephone company workers." "Mrs. Patterson?" David had finished his call and was looking at me with curious interest. "Ms. Reeves mentioned you might be making some changes to the building's management. We hope that won't affect our lease arrangement. We've really built our business around this location." "I'm still learning about my options," I said, "but I appreciate knowing that you're happy here." We spent another 15 minutes touring the upper floors, meeting the other tenants, and reviewing the maintenance records Catherine had brought. Everything was in excellent condition, managed by a property company that Harold and Bobby had hired 5 years ago. The monthly income was exactly what Catherine had described: substantial, reliable, and completely separate from anything I'd ever included in my budget calculations. Back in Catherine's car, I felt a strange sense of unreality. This morning I was worried about whether I could afford to help my daughter save her restaurant. Now I discover I own a building that generates more income in 1 month than I usually spend in 6. How does that feel? I considered the question seriously. "Angry," I said finally. "I'm angry at Harold for keeping this secret. I'm angry at myself for being so financially naive. And I'm angry at Sarah for assuming I'm too old and confused to handle my own money." Catherine nodded, as if she'd expected this answer. "Anger can be useful if you channel it constructively." "What do you mean?" "You have options now that you didn't have this morning. The question is whether you want to use those options to continue solving other people's problems, or whether you want to start making decisions based on your own interests." I thought about Sarah's phone call, the casual way she'd mentioned using my house as collateral for a business loan, the assumption that my resources were available for her use, but that my input wasn't required for the decision-making process. "Tell me about this partner of yours, Morrison." "James Morrison is one of the best estate planning attorneys in the state. He specializes in helping people protect their assets from family interference, trusts, foundations, legal structures that ensure your money stays under your control. Even from my own children? Especially from your own children, when necessary." We drove back toward my house in comfortable silence, both of us lost in thought. As we turned onto my street, I noticed a familiar car parked in my driveway. Sarah's blue Honda Civic, the one I'd helped her buy too. Years ago, when her old car finally died. "It looks like you have company," Catherine observed. Through my living room window, I could see Sarah pacing back and forth, her phone pressed to her ear. Probably calling Michael, probably discussing strategy for convincing her stubborn mother to cooperate with their plans. "Catherine," I said as we pulled up behind Sarah's car, "how quickly can you set up a meeting with this Morrison person? This afternoon, if you—" "I'd like that very much." I gathered my purse and the manila folder Catherine had given me, feeling the weight of Bobby's letter and the property deed inside. What should I tell my daughter about where I've been? Catherine's smile was sharp and satisfied. Tell her the truth. Tell her you've been learning about your options. Sarah appeared on my front porch as I got out of Catherine's car, her expression shifting from relief to confusion as she took in the expensive BMW and the professional-looking woman behind the wheel. "Mom, there you are." I was starting to worry. Sarah's eyes darted between me and Catherine, clearly trying to figure out what was going on. "Who's your friend?" "This is Catherine Reeves," I said, climbing the front steps with new confidence. "She's my attorney." The look on Sarah's face was worth 40 years of keeping secrets. "Your attorney?" Sarah's voice climbed an octave, the way it used to when she was 12 and had been caught sneaking cookies before dinner. "Mom, what's going on? Why do you need an attorney?" I unlocked the front door, acutely aware of Catherine behind me and Sarah's growing agitation. "Would you like some coffee, Catherine? I think we have quite a bit to discuss." "That would be lovely, thank you." Sarah followed us into the house like an anxious terrier, her questions tumbling over each other. "Mom, seriously, what's happening? Did someone try to scam you? Are you in some kind of legal trouble? Is this about the loan?" I busied myself in the kitchen, taking my time with the coffee preparation while Sarah paced behind me. Through the doorway, I could see Catherine settling calmly into the living room, apparently unbothered by the domestic drama unfolding around her. "No one tried to scam me, sweetheart. And no, this isn't about the loan." I measured coffee grounds with deliberate precision, enjoying the way Sarah's impatience crackled through the air. "Though I suppose you could say it's related." "Related how?" Sarah leaned against the kitchen counter, her arms crossed in the defensive posture I remembered from her teenage years. "Mom, you're scaring me. First you cancel the loan without warning, then you disappear for hours, and now you show up with some lawyer." "I didn't disappear, Sarah. I went to see some property I own." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah's expression shifted from anxiety to confusion to something that looked suspiciously like suspicion. "Property you own? What property? You mean this house?" "No, not this house." I carried the coffee tray into the living room, setting it on the table between Catherine and Harold's chair. "Coffee, Sarah?" "I don't want coffee." Sarah's voice was rising again, and I found myself wondering when she'd started speaking to me like I was the child, and she was the exasperated parent. "I want to know what's going on. What property are you talking about?" I settled into Harold's recliner, feeling the familiar comfort of the worn leather against my back. Catherine accepted her coffee with a grateful nod, her expression professionally neutral but her eyes alert with interest. "Your father and his friend Bobby Chen owned a commercial building downtown. They bought it in 1985. I kept my voice conversational, as if I were discussing the weather rather than information that would change everything. "I inherited Harold's half when he died, and Bobby left me his half when he passed away 3 months ago." Sarah stared at me for a long moment, her mouth slightly open. Then she laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. "That's impossible. Dad would have told us about something like that." "Would he?" I took a sip of my coffee, watching my daughter's face over the rim of the cup. The way he told us about the separate savings account he kept for emergencies? The way he told us about the life insurance policy that was double what we thought it was? The color drained from Sarah's face. "How did you know about the savings account?" "I found the bank statements when I was going through his papers after the funeral. $15,000 I never knew existed." I set down my cup carefully. "Just like I never knew about the property that's been generating rental income for the past 2 years. "Rental income?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper now. Approximately $12,000 per month. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking from across the room. Sarah sank into the chair across from me, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. 12,000? Per month? Per month. Catherine cleared her throat delicately. The property is currently valued at approximately $2.8 million. Sarah made a sound like she'd been punched in the stomach. 2.8 million? That's right. I leaned forward, studying my daughter's face. So you see, Sarah, when you called this morning to tell me you didn't want my help anymore, it was quite illuminating. Mom, let me finish. The sharpness in my voice surprised us both. You see, I spent last night lying awake, trying to figure out how to liquidate my retirement funds to help you save your restaurant. I was prepared to give you everything I had, to risk my own financial security for your dreams. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Mom, I'm sorry. We didn't mean... And then you called this morning to tell me that my help was unwanted, that you were adults who could handle your own finances, that you'd spoken to a financial advisor who told you it was better to be independent. We were confused. No, Sarah, you weren't confused. You were embarrassed. I stood up, pacing to the window and looking out at the garden. You were embarrassed by your old mother's modest resources. You wanted my money, but you didn't want the stigma of owing it to someone who wasn't wealthy enough to be impressive. That's not true. I turned back to face her, feeling calmer than I had in months. Isn't it? Tell me, when you and Michael filled out the loan application at the bank, what did you tell them about collateral? Sarah's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. Because Margaret at the bank mentioned that you'd already discussed using my house as security for the loan. My house, Sarah. The home your father and I bought as newlyweds. The place where I nursed him through his final illness. You offered it as collateral without asking my permission. We knew you'd say yes. Did you? I walked back to my chair, feeling the weight of 43 years of motherhood settling around me like armor. Or did you just assume that my property was available for your use? That my home, my security, my future was something you could risk without consulting me? Sarah was crying now, mascara making dark tracks down her cheeks. Mom, please. I know we made mistakes, but we need this loan. The restaurant is our future. It's our dream. Your dream, I corrected. Your restaurant. Your future, your choices. But you're our mother. You're supposed to help us. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and I felt something inside me snap into place. Not break, a line, like a bone that had been set crooked, finally shifting into its proper position. I am your mother, I said quietly, which means I'm supposed to raise children who can stand on their own feet, who can solve their own problems, who don't assume that other people's resources belong to them. I sat back down, accepting the cup of coffee Catherine handed me with steady hands. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. Catherine is going to help me set up some legal structures to protect my assets. I'm going to learn how to manage my own money, make my own decisions, and plan my own future. What about us? Sarah's voice was small, childlike. What about you? What about the restaurant? What about our dreams? I looked at my daughter. Really looked at her. The woman who'd called me this morning to dismiss my help. The woman who'd risked my home without asking. The woman who'd assumed that her needs took precedence over my security. Sarah, I love you. I will always love you. But your dreams are not my responsibility. Mom, you and Michael are adults. You have college degrees, work experience, and access to traditional business loans. You have parents on both sides who could co-sign for you. You have options that don't involve risking your elderly mother's only. But those options are harder. Yes, I said simply. They are. Catherine set down her coffee cup and reached for her briefcase. Mrs. Patterson, shall we discuss the afternoon appointment with Mr. Morrison? Yes, let's. I turned to Sarah, who was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. I'll be out for the rest of the afternoon. When I get back, I'd like you to bring me the loan paperwork you filled out at the bank. All of it. Why? Because I want to see exactly what you told them about my financial situation. And I want to make sure they understand that my house is not available as collateral for anyone's loan. Sarah stood up abruptly, swaying slightly. I can't believe this. You're different. You're not acting like yourself. I considered that for a moment. You're right, I said finally. I'm not acting like the version of myself that you're comfortable with. The version that always said yes, that always solved problems, that always put everyone else's needs first. But that's who you are. No, Sarah. That's who I was trained to be. There's a difference. Catherine stood as well, her briefcase in hand. Mrs. Patterson, shall we? I walked to the front door, leaving Sarah standing in my living room looking lost and confused. I'll be back by dinner time, I called over my shoulder. Let yourself out when you're ready. As Catherine and I walked to her car, I could hear Sarah calling after me, her voice high and desperate. Mom, please. We need to talk about this. I didn't turn around. How do you feel? Catherine asked as we backed out of the driveway. I thought about the question, watching my house recede in the side mirror. Sarah was standing on the porch now, her phone pressed to her ear. Probably calling Michael. Probably trying to figure out how to manage a mother who had suddenly stopped being manageable. Free, I said finally. For the first time in 43 years, I feel free. James Morrison's office occupied the entire top floor of a glass building downtown, with windows that offered a panoramic view of the city Harold and I had called home for 45 years. From this height, I could see the neighborhood where we'd raised our children, the hospital where Harold had died, and somewhere in the distance, the building I now owned. Mrs. Patterson, Morrison said, rising from behind a desk that probably cost more than my annual income, Catherine has told me quite a bit about your situation. I understand. You're interested in protecting your assets from family interference. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with the kind of expensive haircut and tailored suit that suggested he was very good at what he did. His handshake was firm, his manner professional but warm, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone accustomed to solving complicated problems. I'm interested in making sure that I control my own money, I said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. Apparently, that's a more complicated proposition than I realized. Morrison smiled, pulling out a legal pad and a gold pen. In my experience, Mrs. Patterson, family members often have very strong opinions about how their relatives should handle money, especially when significant amounts are involved. Through the window, I could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The weather forecast had called for rain later today, and I found myself hoping Sarah would have the sense to bring in the laundry I'd hung out this morning. Then I caught myself. Sarah was 43 years old. If she couldn't figure out how to protect laundry from rain, that was her problem to solve. Catherine mentioned that there might be ways to structure my assets so that I maintain complete control, even if my family disagrees with my decisions. Absolutely. Morrison leaned forward, his manner becoming more focused. There are several options we could explore, depending on your specific concerns and goals. Revocable trusts, asset protection strategies, even simple will modifications that make your intentions very clear. What would you recommend for someone in my situation? Morrison glanced at Catherine, who nodded encouragingly. Based on what Catherine has told me, I'd suggest we start with a comprehensive revocable trust. It would give you complete control over your assets during your lifetime, while also protecting those assets from claims by creditors or family members who might challenge your decisions. I thought about Sarah standing on my porch 3 hours ago, her face pale with shock and her voice rising in desperation. How often do adult children challenge their parents' financial decisions? More often than you might think. Adult children sometimes convince themselves that their parents are no longer competent to handle money, especially when those parents make decisions the children disagree with. Morrison's expression grew more serious. It's particularly common when there are significant assets involved that the children didn't know about, such as valuable real estate. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. What kind of challenges might they make? Catherine leaned forward. They might question your mental competency. They might claim you're being influenced by outside parties, people like us, for instance. They might argue that you're not capable of understanding the financial implications of your decisions, even though I'm perfectly capable of understanding them. Even though you're perfectly capable of understanding them, Morrison confirmed. I've seen cases where adult children have convinced courts that their parents were incompetent, simply because those parents refused to fund the children's business ventures or pay off their debts. The implications hit me like cold water. I thought about Sarah's reaction this afternoon. The way she'd insisted I wasn't acting like myself. The way she'd looked at me like I'd become a stranger simply because I'd said no to her demands. How would we prevent something like that? Morrison pulled out a thick folder and opened it on his desk. We'd start with a comprehensive competency evaluation by a psychiatrist who specializes in elder law. We'd document your decision-making capacity very thoroughly while you're clearly competent and making rational choices about your assets. And then we'd set up the trust structure with very specific instructions about how your assets should be managed. We'd name successor trustees who would respect your wishes, and we'd include provisions that make it very difficult for family members to challenge your decisions or claim you're incompetent. I watched the storm clouds moving closer, thinking about the conversation I'd need to have with Sarah when I got home. How long would this process take? The initial documentation could be completed within a week. The competency evaluation could be scheduled for early next week. We could have everything in place within 10 days if we move quickly. Why the rush? Catherine asked. Morrison's expression grew more serious. Because once family members start questioning a parent's competency, it becomes much more difficult to establish legal protections. Courts tend to view any sudden changes in estate planning as potential evidence of diminished capacity, especially if those changes occur after family conflicts arise. I thought about that for a moment. So you're saying I should act quickly before Sarah and Michael have time to organize any kind of legal challenge? I'm saying you should act while you're clearly demonstrating rational decision-making and before anyone has reason to question your competency. Morrison leaned back in his chair. From what Catherine has told me, you've already shown remarkable judgment in handling this situation. You discovered you had significant assets, you sought professional advice, and you're taking steps to protect yourself from financial manipulation. Those are the actions of a very competent person. My phone buzzed in my purse, a text message. I ignored it. What about the property itself? How should I handle the rental income? We'd set up a separate business entity to manage the property. That would protect both the income and the asset from any personal liability issues. You'd maintain complete control, but the legal structure would make it much more difficult for anyone to access those funds without your permission. Another text message, then a third. Mrs. Patterson? Catherine was watching me with concern. Is everything all right? I pulled out my phone and glanced at the messages. All from Sarah. Mom, please call me. We need to talk. Michael wants to come over tonight to discuss the situation. We're worried about you. This isn't like you. I showed the messages to Catherine and Morrison. Morrison frowned as he read them. That last message is particularly concerning, he said. Suggesting that you're not acting like yourself could be the beginning of a competency challenge. What do you mean? I mean your daughter might be building a case that you're behaving erratically or making decisions that are out of character. That's often the first step in questioning someone's mental fitness. I felt anger rising in my chest. Not the explosive kind, but the cold, determined kind that had been building all day. So, because I finally said no to her demands, I'm suddenly incompetent? In her mind, possibly yes. Adult children often can't distinguish between a parent who won't give them money and a parent who can't make rational decisions about money. My phone rang. Sarah's number. I declined the call. Catherine, how quickly can you arrange the competency evaluation? I can make some calls this afternoon. If we explain the situation, I think we can get you an appointment early next week. And the trust? Documentation? Morrison was already pulling forms from his file cabinet. We can start the paperwork today. I'll need some basic information about your assets, your family situation, and your goals for the trust. For the next hour, we worked through the details. My assets, which 24 hours ago had consisted of Harold's pension and Social Security, now included valuable real estate, substantial rental income, and enough accumulated funds to ensure I'd never have to worry about money again. More importantly, we worked through my goals. Not just financial security, but independence. The right to make my own decisions without interference from family members who thought they knew better. The ability to help or not help as I chose, rather than as others demanded. My phone rang twice more during our meeting. Sarah. Both times I let it go to voicemail. "Mrs. Patterson," Morrison said as we finished the preliminary paperwork, "I want you to understand something. Once you sign these documents, you'll have significant legal protections. But you'll also be making a very clear statement about your intentions." "What kind of statement?" "That you intend to control your own assets, regardless of what your family thinks about those decisions. That you're prepared to defend your right to make choices they might not like." I thought about Sarah's face this afternoon. The shock and confusion when I'd refused to solve her problems. The way she'd insisted I wasn't. Acting like myself, as if the version of me that always said yes was the only version that counted. "Good," I said. "That's exactly the statement I want to make." Catherine drove me home as the storm clouds finally opened up, rain drumming against the windshield in a steady rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The house looked different somehow as we pulled into the driveway, not changed physically, but changed in meaning. It was no longer just the place where I lived, but property that I owned, controlled, and could protect. Sarah's car was gone, but there was a note tucked under the front door knocker. "Mom, Michael and I will be back at 7 p.m. We need to have a serious conversation about this situation. We're very concerned about the decisions you're making. Please don't sign anything else until we can discuss this as a family. We love you, Sarah." I showed the note to Catherine, who read it with a grim expression. "That," she said, "sounds like the beginning of an intervention." Looked at my watch. It was already 6:15. "Then I guess we'd better be prepared for one." At exactly 7 o'clock, Sarah's car pulled into my driveway, followed by Michael's black pickup truck. I watched from the living room window as they sat for a moment in their vehicles, probably coordinating their strategy. Sarah emerged first, her shoulders set with the kind of determination I recognized from her childhood. The look she'd worn when she was preparing to argue for a later bedtime or permission to attend a party we'd already said no to. Michael joined her on the front walk, carrying what appeared to be a manila folder. He was dressed in his good khakis and the button-down shirt Sarah had bought him for Christmas, the outfit he wore to parent-teacher conferences and bank meetings. They were presenting a united front, prepared for battle. I opened the door before they could knock. "Hello, sweetheart." "Michael." I stepped back to let them in, noting the way they exchanged glances as they entered. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "Mom, we need to talk." Sarah's voice was carefully controlled, the tone she used when she was trying very hard not to lose her temper. "This whole situation today has us really worried." "What situation is that?" I settled into Harold's chair, gesturing for them to sit on the couch. They perched on the edge of the cushions like birds ready to take flight. Michael cleared his throat, pulling papers from his folder. "Mrs. Patterson." "Eleanor, we've been doing some research since this afternoon about asset protection scams that target elderly people." "Asset protection scams?" "Companies that convince senior citizens they need expensive legal services to protect money from their own families." Sarah leaned forward, her expression earnest and concerned. "Mom, these people prey on older adults who are confused about their finances." I felt a familiar flutter of doubt, the old instinct to defer to younger, supposedly wiser. Then I remembered Catherine's sharp intelligence, Morrison's professional competence, and the building I now owned that was generating $12,000 a month in rental income. "I see. And you think that's what happened to me today?" "We think it's possible," Michael said carefully. "The timing is very suspicious. This morning you were willing to help us with the restaurant loan, and then suddenly this lawyer appears with some story about secret property, and now you're talking about trusts and asset protection. The timing is suspicious?" Sarah nodded eagerly. "Think about it, Mom. You've been worried about money since Dad died. You've been stressed about helping us with the restaurant. Then this woman shows up with some too-good-to-be-true story about valuable property that Dad supposedly kept secret for 40 years? I watched my daughter's face as she spoke, noting the way she avoided mentioning the part where she'd called to reject my help before Catherine had ever appeared. The way she glossed over the fact that she'd used my house as collateral without asking. So you think Catherine Reeves is running some sort of scam? We think it's possible, Michael repeated. These companies are very sophisticated. They target widows who are vulnerable and confused about their finances. Confused about my finances. Mom, you haven't had to handle money decisions alone since you married Dad. It's natural that you might be uncertain about complex financial matters. The familiar pattern was so clear now, I wondered how I'd ever missed it. Sarah's tone, patient and condescending. Michael's careful explanations, as if I were a child who needed guidance. The assumption that I was too old, too confused, too female to understand my own financial situation. Tell me, I said quietly, what exactly did you two discuss with the bank about using my house as collateral? They exchanged another glance. Sarah's cheeks flushed pink. We mentioned that you owned your home free and clear, Michael said. It's standard procedure to discuss available assets when applying for a business loan. Available assets? My house is an available asset? Mom, we'd never do anything to put your house at risk. But you were willing to use it as collateral for a $300,000 loan to fund a restaurant that might fail? The restaurant won't fail, Sarah said quickly. We have a solid business plan. Do you? I reached for the folder Catherine had left with me, pulling out the property deed and rental agreements, because according to these documents, I generate more income in 3 months than your restaurant is projected to make in its first year. I spread the papers on the coffee table between us. Sarah and Michael leaned forward, their expressions shifting from concern to confusion to something that looked suspiciously like hunger as they read. This is real? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Very real. The property has been generating income for 2 years since your father died. Income that's been accumulating in an account I didn't know existed. Michael was scanning the rental agreements, his banker's training evident in the way he absorbed the financial details. The monthly income is, this can't be right, $12,000 per month. Plus the property itself is valued at $2.8 million. Sarah sat back hard against the couch cushions. You're a millionaire. It appears so. And this morning, when we called to tell you we didn't need your help anymore. This morning you told me to stop saving for you because you didn't want my help. You said you were adults who could handle your own finances. I kept my voice level, factual. You dismissed $300,000 in assistance because you wanted to be independent. We didn't know, Michael said weakly. Didn't know what? That I might have feelings about being dismissed? That I might have opinions about how my money should be used? That I might not appreciate being managed like a confused child? Sarah was crying again, but this time the tears looked different, less manipulative, more genuinely distressed. Mom, we made a mistake, a huge mistake. Yes, you did. But we can fix it. We can apologize. You can accept that I've made my decision. The room fell silent, except for the sound of rain against the windows and the steady tick of the grandfather clock. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of mascara on her cheeks. What decision? Michael asked. I pulled out the trust documents Morrison had prepared, setting them beside the property papers. I've established a legal trust to protect my assets. I've arranged for competency evaluations to document my mental fitness, and I've made it very clear that I intend to control my own money. Control it how? Sarah's voice was small, defeated. However I choose, maybe I'll travel, maybe I'll donate to charity, maybe I'll help family members who treat me with respect and gratitude rather than entitlement and condescension. And if we don't? Michael's question was quiet, but pointed. Then you'll figure out your own solutions to your own problems, like the independent adults you told me you wanted to be. Sarah looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. We really hurt you, didn't we? The question was so simple, so direct, that it caught me off guard. For a moment, I saw my daughter as she really was, not the manipulative woman who'd called this morning to dismiss my help, but the scared young person who'd built her entire adult life around the assumption that her parents would always be there to solve her problems. "Yes," I said gently. "You really hurt me." I thought about that question for a long time, watching the rain streak down the windows while Sarah and Michael waited in tense silence. "You start by accepting that your financial emergencies are not my responsibility." I said finally. "You start by treating me like a competent adult whose opinions matter. You start by asking instead of demanding, by expressing gratitude instead of entitlement. And then maybe we can build a different kind of relationship. One where I'm your mother, not your emergency fund." Sarah nodded slowly, tears still sliding down her cheeks. "What about the restaurant?" "What about it? Would you consider, could we maybe start over? Ask properly this time?" I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised and loved and enabled for 43 years. The woman who'd called me this morning to reject my help, who'd used my house as collateral without asking, who'd assumed I was too old and confused to make my own financial decisions. "Ask me in 6 months," I said. 6 months of handling your own finances. 6 months of treating me like a person whose feelings matter. 6 months of proving you can survive without using me as a backup. Plan. Michael started to protest, but Sarah held up her hand to stop him. "That's fair," she said quietly. "More than fair." They left 20 minutes later, taking their manila folder of research about elder financial abuse and their assumptions about my competency with them. I watched from the window as they sat in Michael's truck for a long time, talking intently, probably trying to figure out how to rebuild their restaurant plans without their elderly mother's resources. For the first time in 43 years, that was their problem to solve. I walked through my house slowly, seeing it with new eyes. The living room where Harold and I had watched the evening news for 30 years. The kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals for my family. The bedroom where I'd nursed my husband through his final illness. It was still my home. But now, it was also my choice. The phone rang once more before I went to bed. Sarah's number. This time I answered. "Hi, sweetheart." "Mom?" Sarah's voice was hesitant, uncertain. "I just wanted to say thank you." "For what?" "For finally teaching me what it costs to be an adult." I smiled, settling into Harold's chair one last time before heading upstairs to bed. "You're welcome, sweetheart. Sleep well." "You too, Mom. I love you." "I love you too." I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet house, listening to the rain and the grandfather clock and the sound of my own steady breathing. Tomorrow I would start my new life. Not as Harold's widow or Sarah's mother or anyone's emergency solution, but as Eleanor Patterson, a woman who owned valuable property and made her own decisions and controlled her own future. For the first time in decades, I couldn't wait to see what came next.